Welcome to A Case of the Mondays, a podcast by 3R Strategy. We are a pay and reward consultancy supporting organisations of all sizes and sectors to take a fair and equitable approach to pay, communicated clearly and honestly to employees. In this podcast, we invite experts to discuss some of the most pressing issues in the world of HR, culture and leadership. We're keen to explore how we can all work to overcome and navigate these challenges. So, tune in to explore how you could create an environment where people don't just have to come to work, but want to.
Welcome to episode 26 of The Case of the Mondays. I am your podcast host, Rameez, founder and director of 3R Strategy and author of Case of the Mondays. I'm joined today by Mel Francis, the founder of Neuroinclusive HR and director of Neurodiversity at Work. Mel brings over 30 years of HR leadership experience across various sectors and has become a prominent voice in making workplaces more neuroinclusive. Today, we're exploring practical ways organizations can create truly neuroinclusive environments and unlock the potential of diverse talent. Welcome to the podcast, Mel.
Thanks, Rameez. Thanks for inviting me. It's exciting to be here.
Now, I'm really looking forward to speaking to you about this topic, which, I must admit, having worked in HR or reward in particular for such a long time, I don't know as much about, or I don't know as much as I feel I should know about this. So I'm really looking forward to learning more about this. But before I guess we get into the details, can you share what led you to become passionate about neurodiversity in the workplace? Because it's not something which, if somebody's looking to get into HR, it's something that they would immediately think about. So it's quite a niche area. So what led you to specialize, become an expert in this area?
Yeah, it is a niche area. And the joy of this is that actually the thing that led me to it was my son. So it transpires that I've been living with neurodiversity for the last 17 years, but actually I've only known about it for the last 7. And my journey started out with a very anxious 10-year-old who needed to get some support. And so I took him along to our GP and said, here's my really anxious kid. Can you please help? And the GP said, yeah, sure, we'll refer you to CAMS, which is the Child Adolescent Mental Health Service, which I'm sure lots of people have had varying levels of interaction with. They are, like any other department of the NHS, massively oversubscribed. The wait list, the times to get into CAMS is really tricky. And it was in my case. So CAMS said they could see my son in 18 months' time, which, when you're caring for any loved one, that's 18 months too long. So I was really lucky to A, be able to find and B, be able to afford a private child psychologist. There's a massive socioeconomic situation with neurodiversity, and I'm sure we'll get into that as we go through the chat. But so I took him along to the private child psychologist for an assessment for help actually with the high levels of anxiety. And the child psychologist said, yeah, high levels of anxiety, but he also has OCD and he's got some autistic traits. So I kind of left with this triple whammy of stuff that I didn't really know what to do with. And was given the option to explore a diagnosis of autism and to go back into the NHS system to be able to do that, or to go privately. Now, the NHS system is creaking. It's overwhelmed with referrals for neurodiversity diagnoses. At the time that he was referred, the wait list was around 3 to 4 years. There was a report from the BBC a few weeks ago which put the wait list just for ADHD at around 8 years average across the UK. So, people are waiting a long time for diagnoses. And so I did choose to go through the private route, and he was diagnosed with autistic spectrum condition. And at that point, honestly, I didn't know what that meant. I didn't understand why my son had been diagnosed with a condition that someone in his class had who was completely different. And of course, now I know that's the whole point. But at the time, I didn't know enough about autism in his case. And so I went on my own learning journey to understand his diagnosis and quickly jumped from learning about autism to learning about neurodiversity. And the more I learned, the more I realized that as an HR profession, we need to know about this. This is all of us. This isn't, a pocket of people. We've all got a brain. Therefore, we are all neurodiverse. And I didn't really think that I could see this as much in some of the work that we were doing in the HR profession. So I started just kind of offering up to speak to HR groups, speak to CIPD groups, and just share what I knew. And then people started to come to me, which was lovely. And then about 2 years ago, I had the fortune or misfortune, depends on how you look at it, to become self-employed. And now I founded Neuroinclusive HR, and I also work alongside Professor Amanda Kirby, who's a brilliant, globally renowned expert in the space. So yeah, it's great. It's a really fascinating area. And as you said at the beginning, very niche, but one that I think we all need to know about, all like to know about, because it's all of us.
So there's a lot there around, it's really interesting about, you talked about ADHD, autism, all of these different things, and you said how each one of us has a brain and we're neuro. So if somebody was to say, well, I'm still struggling to understand, can you explain to me in, I don't know, a couple of sentences, how would you define neurodiversity?
Sure. I can, yeah. If you break down the word neurodiversity or neurodiverse, it means that our neuros are diverse. Our brains are different. And the reason for that is because our brains are made up of billions of neuros connected in billions of different ways. And also, according to some recent research, around 3,300 different types of brain cells. So our brains are beautifully complex and beautifully unique. So like our fingerprints, there are no two brains that are the same. And therefore, we're all neurodiverse because our brains are all different. But we're not all neurodivergent. And that's a really important distinction, because when we're talking about neurodiversity, what we're talking about, as I say, is all of us, that our brains all work differently. But we know from research that around about 80% of us has a brain that works in a similar way. So we call that neurotypical. So if you think of your stereotypical bell curve, 80% of us are sitting there in the middle, but 20% of us, and we think that may be an underestimation actually, has a brain that diverges from that neurotypical, so is neurodivergent. So what that means is that our brain works differently than the majority. So, and I'll just emphasize the word differently, because I didn't say better or worse, but differently. And sometimes what we see is that the way in which your brain is working differently means that you may have traits that may align to a particular neurodiverse condition, and therefore would lead to a diagnosis of that condition. So it's really about our brains all being different and diverse.
You mentioned an 8-year waiting list on the NHS. Do you think that is, it is really hard to understand why that would be the case? And do you think it's partly because this is something that's not being taken seriously, and so very little resource or time has been allocated to it, and hence there's such a long wait? Because in a way, what you're doing is you're trying to put people off from following through, because nobody's going to wait 8 years for an appointment.
I'm not sure I think of it like that. I think that really does contribute. So I don't think there are enough diagnosticians in the NHS. So the what that has led to actually is a lot of private practices, diagnosticians popping up, and we'll talk about that as well. But I think that what's happened is, so if we look at ADHD and autism, for example, the criteria for diagnosing those two conditions was developed in the 1980s. Those two conditions were categorized or recognized in the 1980s. And they were predominantly categorized by observing boys. So, sometimes when people think about ADHD, they might think about the disruptive boy in the classroom who can't sit still. I'm being hugely stereotypical here, by the way, but that might be the image that springs to mind of a boy with ADHD. And actually, that's what the criteria was based on when the diagnosis was created in the 80s, because that's what they were observing. And then actually what's happened is, since then, our knowledge, understanding, research has increased. We understand that the way in which traits manifest is unique. And we know particularly that the way in which traits manifest within girls is different. So again, stereotypical, but whilst you're watching the disruptive boy at the front of the classroom, you're missing the dreamy girl at the back of the classroom who's watching the butterflies out of the window. Now, her hyperactivity, if that's one of her traits, may be in her brain. Her brain doesn't stop, but her legs and her body do. So what we were looking at was for the signs of the movement, the disruption, etc. We weren't seeing them in some of the girls. And so what happened was a lot of people were missed, and particularly girls. Then as our understanding and the diagnoses have really been refined, the more knowledge that we have in the space, what's happened is that more and more girls and women who now are recognizing their own traits are starting to come forward and want to explore their own potential diagnoses. And sometimes not, actually. We'll talk, I keep saying we'll talk a lot about other things, but diagnosis is something we'll also, the value of diagnosis we'll talk about as well. So I think what's happened now, because in the last few years, we have been talking about neurodiversity much more. We've seen that the conversation has become normalized. Certainly, when my son was at school, there's SEN coordinators, special education needs coordinators who are supporting children through school. They've been in place for a number of years. So kids are coming out of school totally, comfortable with this language, talking about their own experiences, having friends who have diagnoses, etc., really openly. So they're coming through school, they may be going to college and getting support through college. They may go to university, get support through university, and then they're coming to work and they're saying, I'm here, I've got my diagnosis, or I've got these traits. Where is the help for me to really thrive at work? And so we have to be ready to be able to support. It's a legal requirement under the Equality Act as well that we make those adjustments. But I think what it means is that as the research has also increased, we know now that neurodiverse conditions, our brilliant neurodiverse brains, are genetic. In the majority of cases, there are some instances where we may acquire a neurodiverse condition, but in the majority of cases, we're born with our brilliant neurodivergent brains. And so as our kids are starting to be diagnosed, so we're seeing an increase in the number of adults that go, oh, that's me. You were saying that thing about the diagnosis. That's also me. Like, I recognize that in myself, and I hadn't realized it until my child went through diagnosis. And so the conversation has really increased, and the realization for a lot of us has increased, especially as adults. So I think all of these things are creating this kind of perfect storm for people to be exploring or pursuing their own diagnosis, which is then causing an overwhelm in the system. There's just not enough diagnosticians available to cope with the amount of requests that are coming through.
So, Mel, you must be working with lots of organizations And what are some of the common misconceptions that you encounter when you are working with organizations that, for example, do they think that neurodiversity is just about um, people who have ADHD, for example, and not recognizing that it impacts a much greater number of employees? What are the common misconceptions that you come across?
Yeah, so many, Rameez. So actually, what I find is that a lot of people assume that neurodiversity is about autism. And I think that's because of the volume of conversations we have around autism, which is disproportionate to other conditions, actually. We don't talk about dyspraxia nearly as much as autism, dyscalculia. These types of conditions have a far higher prevalence rate, but we don't talk about them as much as autism. And we see organizations have autism-specific recruitment drives, even, for example, especially, and again, stereotypically across tech firms who still have quite a lot of autism-specific recruitment drives. So I think that's probably one of the biggest misconceptions, is that neurodiversity is autism. It's not. It's many different conditions. And the other big misconception is that the label that somebody may come to you with tells you everything you need to know about that person. And what I mean by that is, for example, if or as my son enters into the workforce, if he chooses to tell someone that he has ASD, autistic spectrum disorder condition, they may assume from their knowledge, oh, that means he's socially awkward, or he can't make eye contact, or he's going to be a big introvert. And that's just not the case. There's a great saying that says, if you've met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism. And you can replace autism with any of the neurodiverse conditions. And what I'm constantly helping organizations to understand and appreciate is that we are all brilliantly unique. So regardless of the label, understand what the strengths and challenges of each individual are, because that label won't tell you what the strengths and challenges are, but your preconceptions may need to be tested. You might need to really bring yourself up to speed with what are the strengths and challenges for this person. And the other thing is, the label can be really misleading, because what we know also from research is that overlap of traits and conditions is the rule rather than the exception. So regardless of the diagnosis that someone may have or may not have, actually, lots of people are not choosing to go through diagnosis. They're self-identifying as having particular conditions now. Regardless of that label, it means that you have strengths and challenges, and those may be traits that are typically associated with other conditions, because the overlap of traits and conditions is, as I say, is the rule rather than the exception.
That's so interesting that you're starting to see recruitment drives around this, and you mentioned tech companies, and I think we were discussing this before the podcast. And do you blame Rain Man for these misconceptions? The film. I mean, I have to admit, it is. I do really like that film, but I can see how you wouldn't. And it creates a lot of misconceptions. But isn't that? I mean, it's still. Is that allowed in your recruitment process to actively seek a particular type of individual? Isn't that some form of discrimination?
Yeah, well, that's a really interesting area, isn't it? It would probably be, I think you'd navigate your recruitment process really carefully, but because the neurodiverse conditions are covered as a disability under the Equality Act 2010. Now, lots of people feel very uncomfortable with being classified as having a disability, and I get that, completely understand that. It's not disabling to have a neurodiverse condition necessarily, but the Equality Act defines a disability as a condition that will have impact for more than 12 months. And so neurodiverse conditions typically fall under that banner. So it means that people have the right to not be discriminated against throughout their employment, actually pre-employment, because it includes the recruitment process. So if you have an autism specific, like if you were to say you can only apply for this position if you're autistic, then undoubtedly that would be discriminatory. But if your recruitment process says we invite applications from underrepresented groups, including those from those with a neurodiverse condition, then I think you're kind of, you're on safer ground. However, I think having an autism specific kind of focus is really missing the point here. It's missing the point of we've all got strengths and challenges. So actually, what are key skills, the key strengths that you want somebody to bring to your role? And so that's a really great way to be neuro-inclusive throughout your hiring process. And I encourage people to go back to their blank sheet when they're writing job descriptions. I think someone somewhere, I've been in HR a long time, and I think someone has, made a lot out of creating a job description template, which has just become massively unwieldy and includes desirable, essential, values, blah, 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 and goes on for about 4 pages. To date, I'm yet to find a job description that actually matches the job that you're doing. But if anyone's got one, I'd love to see it. But what it means is that if you go back to a blank sheet to write your job description and just be clear about this is the job, and these are some of the typical tasks that you're going to have to undertake. These are the skills that you're going to need. These are the qualifications that you're really going to need. All these first-class honours degrees from a Russell Group University, rubbish. You do not need a degree to do every job. But then once you've created a job description that truly reflects the job, you can advertise the job in a way that helps people to know what skills you need, what experience you need. Because much like women will start to take themselves out of the process unless they meet the criteria, so will those who want to look at matching exactly. And that may be higher prevalence amongst those who are neurodivergent. And so you're starting to filter out your talent because people are not matching exactly what you're looking for in your 4-page job description. So really starting at that point is a great way to be neuro-inclusive. And you do have a legal requirement to be inclusive and to not breach the Equality Act throughout employment.
So that's a great tip around looking at job descriptions. And I know you mentioned the degree, and I think that goes far beyond neurodiversity. It looks at things like social mobility, because nobody can, so many people can't afford to have that. And I think thankfully a lot of organizations are starting to look at that and remove that as a requirement. But what are some of the other practical and quick steps that you think HR can take to start making their recruitment processes more neuro-inclusive?
Yeah. The recruitment, I think also making sure that your assessment process reflects the job that you're looking to recruit for. So obviously there's been a big move, hasn't there? Not big move, but competency-based interviews are the standard way of being able to assess someone's skills for a job. But actually, if you think about jobs like a driver, for example, is the example that I go to. So if you're looking to recruit someone to be a driver, that job description surely doesn't need to be more than about half a page long. And also, how are you going to assess them? Competency-based interview is not going to tell you how good a driver they are, but having a practical driving session with them is going to give you more insight into how well they do the job. So I've used that as a really basic example, but, take that principle and apply it to the jobs that you're recruiting for. Is a leadership position, by creating a bridge out of spaghetti and marshmallows, is that really going to tell you how great a leader they are? There are some tasks that I just think we've just kind of gone with, and it's so it carries on, that really just are not assessing the skills or the experience that you should be looking to assess. And so it means that we're filtering out talent at every step, because we're not necessarily allowing all talents to shine through those processes. So being truly inclusive, I would also look at the way in which you're assessing skills.
Yeah, I agree. I think, it's funny how a lot of jobs use that competency-based approach, and
Yeah.
you don't assess anything that you would practically need someone to do in that job. So I think that driver example is a great example where that may not necessarily happen. But for example, one of the things that we do is we have some content roles, and so as part of the process, and you can tell me if this is neuroinclusive,
Go on.
we send a video out, and
Right.
because they're a content person, we ask them to watch that 5 or 10 minute video and then turn that into a blog or or an infographic, and that tells us, practically how that's the sort of thing we would want that person to do in the job, and that tells us what that person would be like, rather than simply just asking them to share stories about their leadership skills or so on. So do you think that that's the sort of example that should be applied to anything such as finance? And because, I think the other thing with that is they can do this in their own time, because some people can get quite nervous at interviews and they might not, they put too much pressure on themselves. And so do you think sending things in advance or giving people tests to do in their own time is something you would recommend?
Yeah, definitely. I think your example is great, because firstly, sending videos, etc., out is really valuable. So the other thing that we need to think about is differing formats for people. So we're not all going to be able to take written information in. We're going to need to have different formats for people to be able to process that information. I think anything we can do to help candidates to feel comfortable with our process in advance is really important, because let's face it, very few of us love an interview. It is a nerve-wracking experience. We don't really enjoy doing it. We know it's a necessary evil in order to get us into jobs, but I've yet to meet anyone that really loves an interview process. So by sending stuff in advance, like the format in the interview details in different formats, for example, by sending information about where the interview is going to take place, how you get there, where you park, or what train line you take to get there, which exit you take from the station. I saw someone recently actually who videoed themselves leaving the station, showing you which stairs to go to, which way to come out to go to the building. This was for an event that they were hosting. And I thought that was brilliant. And that's the sort of thing that you just record once, stick on your website, and then have it there forevermore, couldn't you, for future candidates to be able to find their way to your building. Also, another great move that I've seen is organizations who send their interview questions out in advance. And if you're using an applicant tracking system, you can often set your ATS up to automatically send the questions to candidates 24 hours in advance of the interview. And also, I've seen John Lewis Partnership, for example, have just recently taken the step to publish all of their competency-based questions on their website. So they're already available for anybody. Oh, in fact, all of us can go and have a look at their competency-based questions. Supporting my son through the process recently, he did request the questions in advance from 2 employers, actually, differing experiences. The first one said no. So they said they would go away and ask the panel, came back and said the panel have decided not to give you the questions. The reaction, the physical reaction from him was palpable. he just said, I don't want to go. I don't want to go. I'm really nervous about going. It was going to be in their administrative head office, which is like in the city centre with 3 managers. It's really big for a kid that's going into their first ever job at apprentice level. This is schooly, but this isn't kind of director level. And without any pre notice of what's going to be covered, he just didn't want to go. And you then reflect that or flip that to another company that said, no problem, we'll send it to you. We'll send you the questions 24 hours in advance. And they did. And he diligently sat and prepared for his interview. And he had a much better experience. Now, it didn't mean that the interviewers couldn't ask follow-up questions or have conversation with him or build rapport or get to know him. And I think this is where we have to really, as HR professionals, help to just deal with some of this preconception around some of the antiquated thoughts of, well, we give them the questions in advance, someone else might prepare their answers for them, or they might just run them through AI and come up with all the answers. Yeah, they might. Absolutely. But your job as an interviewer is to build rapport, to get to know them, is to assess whether or not they have the skills. So, take that on board and help to navigate that process and help your candidate to have a really great experience, because that candidate today may be your future applicant again in the future, or maybe your employee might tell their friends, their family about their experience as well. So that candidate experience is really important. And more than that, you really want to be truly inclusive throughout that process. And this way, you're being neuroinclusive by having those different formats, enabling people to come prepared to represent themselves in the best way possible as well.
It's funny you mentioned that video, because I saw that as well, because I was fake to from HR Coffee Time, and I was there at the
Yes.
event. So
Oh,
I
were
think
you? Yeah, it was Faye. She was brilliant.
everyone I spoke to, just everyone kept talking about how great an idea it was to do that video.
Yes. Right. And it didn't take her like days of time, did it? It was her just videoing her journey from there to from A to B, and it's so helpful. Yeah, I love Faye.
I also think, we're talking about recruitment here, and it's a two-way process. I know a lot of people are stressed and worried about finding a job, and they don't always necessarily see it that way. But I do think that, when we have organizations that are saying, no, the panel has decided not to send this to you, we should see that as a positive sign, because you could end up working for that company and, not be given any, allowances or adjustments that you need, but instead you find out early on what that company is like. So I think candidates probably should use the recruitment process as a way of saying, being more selective and saying, this is how they treated me in the recruitment process, and I'm going to choose not to go work there.
Yeah, it's a really good point, Rameez, but it's also a complete breach of the Equality Act. So you have a requirement, even at recruitment stage, to make adjustments to enable somebody to fully participate in the process. And actually, we've seen an increase in the number of claims that are being brought by those that have applied for jobs and not been selected, because they're saying you didn't select me on the basis of my disability. And actually, in this circumstance that I've just described, that's exactly what that is. It is pure and simple disability discrimination. I've told you I've got a condition that's covered under the Equality Act. I've asked for an adjustment to enable me to participate in the process, and you've declined that. But the reality is, I've got a 17-year-old kid who's like, Mum, don't make a fuss. Don't, hold back. You're not allowed to go in. And I have to respect him from that point of view. But honestly, if anyone listening wants any help with trying to make their recruitment processes more neuroinclusive, please get in touch, because this is why I do what I do, is to really help to increase the accessibility and to really diminish some of those preconceptions about what being neuroinclusive is about, because that's not difficult. If you're having to go and ask the panel if it's okay for you to release questions, that's really not the way that it works. Go and tell the panel that a candidate is receiving the questions, because that's what our requirement is under the Equality Act. So yeah, it's tricky, but you're right. It does tell you that they are not the right organisation because they're not neuroinclusive. What's really interesting, just to take this a step further, is through some research with the City and Guilds Foundation in conjunction with Do It Solutions, we've been running the Neurodiversity Index reports, and we're now in the 3rd year of that. So if the first report, actually, in year 1, we found that 72% of those who responded said that they wouldn't disclose that they're neurodivergent in their workplace because they're worried about the impact that would have on their career. So I still think that we've got a lot of people who will be coming through our processes as applicants, as candidates, as employees. This isn't about them. How can we recruit more of them? This is about all of us. So we already have neurodiverse talent within our workplaces, but we know that lots of people won't tell you because they're worried about their career. They are worried about not being able to progress. They're worried about standing out. And I think as the workforce is really changing, and actually the challenge for people to get jobs is really changing, I think that's becoming worse. People are less likely to tell you because of the scarcity of jobs available now. It's really flipped on its head, hasn't it, in the last few years? Then people are less likely to tell you that they're neurodivergent because they won't want to be treated differently or less assessed as being less capable at doing those jobs. So I think it'll be interesting to see where we go over the next few years, but it's important that we're still ensuring that our processes are truly neuroinclusive.
Yeah, I mean, that's really interesting around that 72% stat that you shared, because, I can see a lot of biases around this. And I guess a lot of it is to do with lack of awareness. Like you said, it's the perception of if somebody is, autistic or has ADHD, that they're going to be not going to be able to deliver at the same level as someone else. So we've had some great tips around recruitment. So let's now look at people who are in the role. Can you share some examples of an organization that you know of, or maybe you worked with, that have successfully made some changes to support their neurodivergent employees?
Yeah, sure. So I would call out Eon as being a great example of a company that I've worked with personally, who have worked to change some of their practices, being far more neuroinclusive. We've seen it from Admiral Insurance, or another one that I would also call out as having been really championing their neuroinclusivity, and Specsavers is another. So there are lots of big organizations that have helped to increase awareness of neurodiversity through things like awareness sessions, through training their line managers, which I think is really important. Along with Amanda Kirby at Do It Solutions, we also run a neurodiversity HR masterclass where we train HR professionals, EDI professionals in neurodiversity and understanding neurodiversity and how to be neuroinclusive at each stage of the employment life cycle. So that's really increasing, and we've seen clients who have sent their HR teams through there, which is great, because I feel like in the workplace, if you're an employee who is looking for support, where might you go? So you might go to your line manager. Depends whether you have the confidence to be able to do that, take that 72% into account. So let's train the line managers. You might go to HR. So let's make sure HR have got the knowledge that they need. But you also might look for someone who can be more of an ally around the organisation. So to that end, we also train people to be neurodiversity champions, which is a CPD certified program. And it's just lovely because we spend a whole day with neurodiversity champions, teaching them about neurodiversity, really deep diving into that, but also talking to them about their role as a champion, which is not about being an expert or diagnosing. It's about being someone to go to be able to signpost, to support, etc., within and outside of their organisation. So, and there are, I think in the last year we've trained something like 200 champions. So it's really increasing that organisations have champions available, and just know that you can go to someone to talk to.
So you mentioned neurodiversity champions, training managers, training HR. So I guess there's a big culture change that we're looking to have as part of this. But are there also, in the same way that we talked about recruitment and looking at your job description and things like sending out questionnaires in advance, are there any practical tips like that? Because let's say you are a manager working in an organization that doesn't necessarily value neurodiversity in the same way, or they're not putting the resources towards it, but you as a manager want to do something. So what are those small steps or practical steps that a manager or a standalone HR person could take to try and make some change?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So, if you think about being neuroinclusive at each step of the employment life cycle, as you say, we've already kind of covered attraction and recruitment, but thinking about how you onboard people into your organization, what information are you giving? What opportunities are you giving to really help them to become familiar with the job, to become familiar with the team? So that might be something like creating a dictionary of 3-letter acronyms. Every organization has got loads of them, haven't they? We all go into a new job and everyone's going to the DFY, the GIG, all of these things that come up and you're like, what the hell is that? And creating a dictionary electronically or somewhere in a central place that everyone can go to is just a great thing that we can do, and we can keep adding to it. But also thinking about, how do we get to know each other when I've started? How do you get to know what my strengths are, what my challenges are? And we don't need to have that attributed to any label of any kind, but just understanding strengths and challenges is really valuable. And then sharing that in the context of the team. So it's not just, oh, Mel's joined, let's all put a spotlight on Mel. Great, that's nice. Off we all go. It's also, and Rameez, share your strengths and challenges. And now let's think about what this means for us in the context of our new construct of a team. So now we've got additional strengths and challenges where we can think about how we can utilize those across the team. And also practical things like sending agendas for meetings in advance is really valuable. Letting people know what's coming. Using AI tools now to be able to record the meeting, but also to be able to determine who has got the actions. Being clear about deadlines. Deadlines is one of those things that I think we can be quite flippant about. Could you do that piece of work? Yeah, sure. And we just kind of go with it in a very fluid way. But actually, quite a lot of us are going to find not having a deadline really distracting. So being clear about when you want something done by is really important, but also not going so far as to be prescriptive about how you want it done. And I think that's a real leadership and management kind of challenge, because I think as we get further into our careers and we become more senior, I think we feel like we have to tell people how to do something. But in some ways that can really encroach on creativity. So you're really not allowing people to sort of flourish. And also it means that you get different ways of doing things. So deadlines are really important, including on job adverts, by the way, because there's been this real shift, hasn't there, towards the job will close when we've got enough applicants. Well, when's that? Do I need to put my job in? Do I need to do it today? Have you got enough? Have you got enough by 5 o'clock? There's this kind of panic over when have you got enough? Well, I'm not going to bother because you probably have got enough, but you just haven't counted them yet. So be clear about when your job adverts will close, but also be clear about what the deadlines are for pieces of work, or if you're going through restructures, make sure that you're giving people enough time to be able to take information in, but also giving that information in differing formats as well. So again, back to what I said earlier about we're not all going to be able to read the piece of or the 6-page email. We might want that in video format, or we might want it in both formats. So making sure that we give information, especially when there are big change projects, in different ways can be really valuable as well.
I'm definitely going to take that tip of sending the agenda in advance. I think it's something I'm very bad at. So
I think most of us
I've
are.
added it to my my feedback list.
Great. Like that.
The other thing you mentioned was around giving information in different formats.
Yeah.
It's I mean, I can definitely see that that works in a lot of different areas. It's actually something that we do as well, because we're working all
Right.
around pay and reward comms. So how do we
Mhm.
communicate pay to our employees? And I remember we were running a session with employees, and they were saying, well, I didn't know we had a pay range. I didn't know we had this and that. And then we spoke to
Mhm.
HR, and they said, oh, we just put it on the internet and everyone should know this.
Right.
And then,
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
knowing that some people, like visuals, some people like videos, and then some people like to read a guide. Some people just want to have a one-to-one with their line manager. And so it's recognizing all of those different ways that we can communicate to people, and not just make the assumption that, we put this information out and everyone should now know it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Um,
And it's exciting as well, just thinking about different ways of being able to communicate and different ways of, people want information really instantly, don't we? We're all in this kind of social media generation now where we can just go and watch 3-minute video. So being able to replicate that, I think sometimes in the workplace, to ensure that information, especially where it's really important information, is being able to be received by everybody.
so the future of work is, I mean, I guess this gets said a lot, is changing, and it's changed, I guess, since COVID, where we have a lot more people working from home, whether it's hybrid working or complete remote working. I mean, we're a complete remote company and always have been. We meet once a quarter, and for the whole day, and then we have some sort of team activity, and for us it works really well. I think it also, as we publicize this, it also attracts candidates when we advertise jobs who prefer that way of working. How do you think that this different way of working, with hybrid working or completely remote working, has that helped people who are neurodivergent? And how do you see the workplace changing in the future in order to accommodate more neurodivergent people? Because, as you say, this is starting to become a lot more prevalent, and people are becoming a lot more aware of this.
Yeah. I think that COVID did us a lot of favors really in that way, didn't it? With just realizing that we could work from home, still be productive, still be able to communicate with each other, etc., has been great. And I think from a neurodiversity point of view, what it's meant is that people have been able to really thrive in environments that really suit them. So, some people just love being in their home environment, working on their own, whereas other people don't. They want to be in an office with others. And sometimes what we see is, like with your organization, just to use 3R as an example, you're completely remote, but that doesn't mean that you can't go to the local cafe and work, or the local shared workspace. People have been much more creative in the ways in which they're working. It also means that we're not all schlepping to and from a place of work, wasting productive time on journeys as well. I think that's made a big difference. And also not just wasting time. A lot of those who are neurodivergent will really struggle with that sort of sensory overload of being in busy buses or busy trains or busy high streets as they're trying to commute to and from work as well. So we've seen a real shift in that regard. What I worry about in some ways is this latest trend, which is the call to return to the office. You know, we've seen it in some of the big companies like Amazon, for example, who decided that they're going to stop working from home from 2025. And, you know, they just kind of put that out as a carte blanche, right? Everyone back to the office. Now, that worries me in many ways. You know, those people who've got caring responsibilities, those who have, you know, put their lives around working remotely, they might have moved a long way from their office, etc., is one thing. But also from a neurodivergence point of view, that environment is really important, that we're thinking about the different ways in which we thrive, the different environments within which we thrive. So having alternative ways of working or places to work, so quiet spaces versus open plan spaces, giving people tools like you know, being able to wear your headphones in the office, for example, might be really valuable for some people. So I think there's a real shift at the moment. I think this is because of the current economic situation and the way in which, you know, suddenly this edict of we need to have more water cooler moments, I mean, what on earth, is playing out in a way that I think that worries me for diversity in the workplace, for sure.
I think a lot of it has to do with real estate and the overheads. And I think businesses are trying to justify ways to bring people back into the office with things like the water cooler moments, I think that you're talking about. It's, you know, let's say that you have employees or an organization where they say, well, you do have to come back into the office. And so people have no choice. What changes do you think could be made in that physical workplace in the future where, you know, people do have to make that commute and go in? But is there something that can be done in the workplace practically that could help be more neuro-inclusive?
Sure. I think that the working environment is one thing. So having the option to work in different environments, so the quiet spaces or the open plan offices, or, you know, being clear about, you know, team meetings, that you'll have different ways in which you're able to take everyone's preferences into account, is one way of doing that. The other way is allowing flexible working. And I mean this in a kind of, you know, you're not paying lip service to flexible working, but you're acknowledging that some people are going to be able to commute better if you can let them start at 10 a.m., for example, and that's okay. So, you know, working different patterns is going to be more suitable for lots of us, actually. Some of us with childcare responsibilities, some of us with elder care responsibilities. You know, all of these things are still covered under the disability banner of the Equality Act. So whether that's directly or indirectly in caring for others. So really being conscious of, you know, if you have got this big return to work and mandating days in the office, for example, being conscious of the impact that has on people and inviting people to explain what will help them to really work best in that situation. But reacting to it in a way that's positive and supportive, rather than making people feel like they're being really difficult in asking. And also appreciating that actually in this current environment and with the economic situation, people may feel less able to ask you for accommodations and for changes because they may feel like that will be impacting on them in a negative way. So how do we create a culture of being truly inclusive, not just we're going to do this because we've got to tick the box to say we've done it? So, and sometimes having employee resource groups can help, having senior leaders who are sponsors for these kinds of initiatives or for particular groups can also be really helpful, just to make sure that those things happen rather than just mentioned and not really something that we're going to commit to.
I was smiling earlier when you were talking about headphones, because I last worked in a corporate environment, like in the office every day, around 9 years ago. And I remember I always used to have my headphones on. And sometimes I would just put my headphones on, even if I wasn't listening to anything. So I want to be in my own space there.
So and a lot of us
I
do,
think,
right? That doesn't mean that this isn't exclusive to those who are neurodivergent, right? This is what I always say is, there isn't a one size fits all in making adjustments and accommodations for people. And it's not just those who are neurodivergent that would find things beneficial. I joke about, we don't have a drawer full of things like, oh, you've got ADHD. Let me just go to my ADHD drawer. Here you go. Here's the fidget toys. These are for you. And dyslexia. Yeah, here's the beige paper. That's not how it works. This is about, some of us will all love a fidget toy. We've all sat next to the person with a clicky pen, haven't we? Or the one that doodles on their pad, or, that's accommodations for all of us. We are all doing things in different ways. So things like, another really easy thing is just giving the people the option to have their cameras off on video calls. Because some people, this is going to be hell. Sitting on a seat, sitting still, concentrating for anything more than 20 minutes is going to be really testing. But if you say you can have your video off, that means I can be standing up, I can be moving around, I can be doing 6 emails as well as listening to you, because that's how my brain works and that's how I concentrate. So understanding that we are all different and we're all going to do things in different ways means that we can really create an environment of acceptance and tolerance of the different ways in which we want to work.
So thanks, Mel, for all your insights and tips, but I can't let you go without my question, which I ask all my guests, which is, what is your favorite film?
Okay. My favorite film, Rameez, for anyone else who is also, of a similar age, I'm 50. The film I grew up with and love and have watched probably 50 times and I will never tire of is Dirty Dancing.
Okay. I have to admit, I don't think I've ever watched the whole thing.
Oh my gosh. Homework, Rameez.
Yeah.
You need to watch it, take it in, learn all the lines, and then go to the show.
I do know the soundtrack. I know the music, but I don't think I've ever watched it. But yeah, you've given me something to do now. So there might be people within HR or line managers listening right now and thinking, there's a lot of things for them to think about and consider. But are there any resources that you would also recommend for people to go and look at to be more neuroinclusive, and how can people get in touch with you?
Sure. So the resources I would recommend, if you go to doitprofiler.com, that is the website of Do It Solutions, which was founded by Professor Kirby. If you follow her on LinkedIn, then she sends out a weekly newsletter, which is always informative, and she's always sharing resources and information, which is really helpful. The other website that you can go to is neurodiversityweek.com. So Neurodiversity Celebration Week is sponsored each year by Lexic, and they have on their website loads of resources that can help with for parents, for children, for schools, for employers relating to neurodiversity as well. And they're all freely available. You can contact me through my website, which is neuroinclusivehr.com, or you can email me, melanie.francis@neuroinclusivehr.co.uk. And also, please do come and connect with me on LinkedIn. I share lots of information, as you can imagine, on neurodiversity, and I'd love to hear from you.
Thanks a lot, Mel, for all of your insights and tips. I've taken down a few things that I need to be implementing in my job, such as sharing of agendas. Thanks everyone for listening. Hope you found this useful, and we will see you on the next episode of Case of the Mondays.
You've been listening to A Case of the Mondays. Feel free to share this episode with anyone you think might find it useful. Similarly, if you have any questions about what we've discussed today or would like to suggest a topic for future episodes, get in touch by emailing podcast@3r-strategy.com or head over to 3r-strategy.com to sign up to our mailing list for regular news and updates.